When an overzealous HOA neighbor illegally poured cement into my backyard creek, I lost more than just a waterway. I lost peace. But karma has a strange way of flowing back. One summer storm, one broken foundation, and suddenly her pristine basement became a flooded sanctuary for the very fish she buried. Never thought a babbling creek could cause so much trouble. It wasn't just water slipping between stones. It was peace, memory, and home. The sound of its chatter in spring mornings, the way dragonflies hovered just above its cool surface, the gentle gurgle that made insomnia bearable. That creek had run behind my family's property for generations. My grandfather built a wooden bench facing it, my mother planted her daylilies along its bank, and I spent childhood afternoons tossing pebbles, pretending they were ships at sea. It wasn't large, not wide or dangerous, just 3 feet across and maybe a foot deep, but it was ours. It was alive. And then came Karen. Her name wasn't actually Karen, of course. It was Margaret Whitmore. But in every possible sense, she embodied the spirit of the archetype. President of the Homeowners Association for the past 7 years, she had surgically removed joy from the neighborhood with the precision of a military operation. Holiday decorations must be down by January 2nd. Grass may not exceed 2.5 inches in length. Porch furniture must be HOA approved. Even our mailboxes had to match a designated color palette, faded sandstone or dignified rust. When Margaret walked down the sidewalk, dogs stopped barking, children disappeared, and adults pretended to check their phones. She had it out for me from the beginning. Maybe it was because I refused to join the HOA. Legally, I didn't have to. My house predated the development by decades. While the rest of Maple Hollow was born from blueprints and HOA restrictions, my land had been carved out long before anyone cared about uniformity. I wasn't a rebel, just a relic. But to Margaret, that made me dangerous. It started with letters. Polite at first. "We noticed excessive water runoff in your yard. Please take measures to ensure neighborhood compliance." Then warnings. Unapproved landscaping near shared community zones. Finally, threats. The HOA reserves the right to take corrective action should non-compliance continue. I ignored them. The creek wasn't runoff. It was spring-fed, cutting through the property naturally since at least 1908. I had the surveyor's records to prove it. Still, Margaret insisted it was a hazard and an unauthorized water feature. One morning I woke to the sound of machinery. At first I thought it was city work, a road crew maybe, or someone fixing the main. But when I looked out my window, I saw a cement truck parked half on my lawn. Men in reflective vests were unfurling hoses down into the creek bed. One of them was already pouring. The cold concrete was filling the gentle stream, silencing the babble forever. I sprinted outside barefoot, heart pounding, and screamed, "What the hell are you doing?" A foreman looked up. Order from the HOA, said it was a mosquito hazard, told us to fill it in. "It's private property," I shouted, voice cracking. "Get off my land!" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Take it up with them." And just like that, years of history were buried under gray sludge. The next week was a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and hollow apologies. The HOA denied responsibility, of course, claimed it was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Margaret sent a letter, typed, not even signed, saying they would reevaluate future environmental mitigation procedures. Meanwhile, my creek was gone, and my blood boiled. But nature doesn't forget. I walked the property that evening in the silence left behind. Without the creek's murmur, everything felt wrong. The air was still, thick, too quiet. Even the frogs were gone. What once had been a lively ribbon of nature now looked like a battlefield, a long gray scar where life used to be. The cement hadn't just covered the water, it had smothered the ecosystem. But in that silence, something inside me woke up. It wasn't just about the creek anymore, it was about what it represented. This land wasn't just property, it was a legacy. I had let Margaret push too far, and now she had crossed a line. My family's land, my sanctuary, had been desecrated, and no HOA clause or self-important president was going to get away with it. So I started digging, literally and metaphorically. I started with the public records, found the HOA charter, their bylaws, their authority limits, My house and lot were explicitly exempt from jurisdiction due to its grandfathered status. I requested footage from a neighbor's Ring doorbell, showing the cement truck rolling in. No city permit, no warning. Then I called the Department of Environmental Protection. Turns out, filling a spring-fed stream, on private land no less, without an EPA-reviewed permit was a serious violation. The kind that carries fines, or worse. I compiled it all, dated photos of the creek from the last decade, testimony from the old county hydrologist who knew the spring by name, satellite imagery, wildlife documentation. Even a couple of environmentalist friends I knew from college weighed in, horrified by what they called deliberate ecological sabotage. Then I filed the report. Meanwhile, Margaret was blissfully unaware. She strutted through Maple Hollow as if she'd done the neighborhood a favor. She even hosted a weekend garden party where she bragged about eliminating unsightly swamp water from the perimeter of the HOA. I attended uninvited, stood in the back with a cup of oversweetened lemonade, and listened. When she made a joke about frogs croaking for good, I smiled, but inside I was boiling. The state's investigation didn't take long to start. Turns out people in Margaret's position rarely read the fine print. They just liked telling others what to do. Within 2 weeks, I received a call from an environmental compliance officer. They had already issued a cease and desist and were preparing for an on-site inspection. I invited them over with coffee and full access to everything. When Margaret found out, she was livid. I got a certified letter that screamed in every line. She accused me of inciting state interference and slandering the HOA. She demanded a neighborhood mediation session. I agreed, happily. When the day came, I brought every document, every photo, every legal record, and I let her hang herself. She denied giving the cement order. I produced the signed invoice from the concrete contractor, listing the HOA as the payer. She claimed it was for sidewalk repairs. I produced timestamps showing the truck at my property. She tried to spin it. The mediation officer wasn't impressed. Still, legal wheels turned slowly. The EPA sent their own agents to assess. Soil samples were taken. Water flow reports were run. But what really tipped the scales was something Margaret hadn't expected at all: the rain. A storm rolled in, fast and furious. Maple Hollow's perfect lawns turned into sponge cakes. Gutters overflowed. Streets glistened with runoff. And Margaret's basement, pristine and decorated like a Better Homes spread, took the worst hit. The cemented creek had rerouted the natural drainage of the entire area. Without the flow channel, stormwater collected right behind her property line, where my old stream used to guide it away harmlessly. The pressure built, the foundation cracked, and overnight her basement became a lagoon. 3 feet of muddy water filled her tiled floor, floating ottomans, family photos, and an antique cedar chest. But that wasn't all. The storm had reawakened the buried spring. A small fissure had cracked open the cement, and nature had pushed back. A steady stream now poured directly through the ground and into her house. I watched from my back porch as fire trucks, sump pumps, and HOA board members crowded her driveway. Margaret stood in her bathrobe, hair soaked, mascara streaked, screaming at everyone, especially me. I didn't even flinch. She wanted a war. She got one. But the best part? The fish were back. Not many, just a few little minnows I'd seen darting around the puddles that formed on my side of the old creek. Somehow, despite the cement and disruption, life had found a way. And now, they swam freely through the mess in Margaret's basement, darting between floating flip-flops and bobbing candles from Pottery Barn. Her basement had become the fish tank of poetic justice. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the flood itself. Margaret tried to claim it was my fault, that somehow I had engineered the flood, that I'd sabotaged her foundation. She even accused me of planting fish. That accusation made me laugh out loud, right there in front of the city inspector. Fish. As if minnows carried buckets and plotted revenge. But her desperation wasn't surprising. Control freaks unravel fastest when nature reminds them they're not in charge. What did surprise me was the neighborhood's shift. People who'd once avoided eye contact now waved as I passed. A couple of residents dropped off fresh bread and pie. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kellerman, slipped a note into my mailbox. I never liked her. She made me cut down my wind chimes. You're a hero. For the first time in years, I felt less like the local oddity and more like a folk hero. The guy who stood up to the HOA tyrant, the one who got his creek back, and karma delivered. But things weren't done shifting. The environmental investigators weren't finished. The state ruled that the HOA's actions had violated multiple codes, including destruction of a natural waterway, unpermitted land modification, and negligence resulting in property damage. Fines were issued, heavy ones. Margaret tried to shift the blame to the rest of the board, but they turned on her instantly. Within a month, she was removed as HOA president in a vote that was nearly unanimous. The one holdout? Her husband, Paul. And even he abstained from the second vote. She still lived in her house, but the glory was gone, the perfect garden wilted. Her prized hydrangeas never recovered from the basement moisture. The shutters peeled, the mailbox leaned, and for once, nobody reminded her of it. Because nobody cared what Margaret Whitmore thought anymore. I, on the other hand, was busy with plans. The EPA's ruling came with a mandate for restoration. The creek had to be rehabilitated, fully and at HOA expense. Contractors came in, jackhammered the cement, and carried it away in dump trucks. Biologists helped reconstruct the stream bed. Native plants were replanted. The spring was tapped and channeled back into its proper path. And through it all, I watched. The day they reintroduced the minnows was one I'll never forget. Little silver flashes darting back into familiar waters as if they'd never left. A child of one of the workers spotted a frog and squealed with joy. Dragonflies danced again above the ripples. The bench my grandfather built was cleaned and reseated, this time facing a creek restored not just by nature, but by justice. But this wasn't just a victory lap. It was a lesson. Power, when misused, will always crack under the weight of truth and time. Margaret learned that the hard way. I learned it watching her unravel, first in court, then in public, and finally alone in her slowly deteriorating house. One evening she came to my door. It was a surprise. I hadn't spoken to her since the mediation hearing. She looked older, more tired, and not just because of the stress. She carried no clipboard, wore no pearls, and instead of her usual firestorm entrance, she just stood there. "I came to apologize," she said quietly. I said nothing. She continued, "I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping order, protecting the neighborhood. I didn't understand. I didn't care to understand." Her eyes welled up, and she took a breath. "But I do now. What I did was wrong." It was tempting to slam the door, to tell her she'd earned every bit of her misery. But then I remembered the creek, how it hadn't fought back with fury, but with quiet resilience. It didn't need revenge. It just needed room to flow. "I accept your apology," I said. "But the creek's not yours to manage. It never was." She nodded, thanked me, and left. That was the last time we ever spoke. Since then, the neighborhood changed. The new HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Luis Delgado, abolished half the outdated rules and launched a community listening project. Kids painted birdhouses that were now allowed on porches. People hung wind chimes again. Gardens flourished with color and creativity. For the first time, Maple Hollow felt alive. As for me, I rebuilt, not just the land, but my spirit. I started leading nature walks along the creek for local schools. One group even named the stream Justice Brook. I liked that. It felt earned. And every now and then, when the air is still and the water sings, I swear I can hear the laughter of the past echoing in the babble. Justice had flowed, nature had spoken, and peace, like water, found its way back home. It began with a shudder. Not an earthquake, not thunder. Just a quiet, localized tremor that rattled the plates in my kitchen cabinet one warm October morning. At first I thought it was my imagination, or maybe an old pipe groaning, but then my dog Murphy bolted from his bed and refused to come back inside. That same afternoon, a sinkhole swallowed a portion of Maple Hollow's Central Park. It wasn't dramatic at first. A low groan, a lurch, and then the ground gave way, pulling a corner of the playground into a yawning, muddy crater. No one was hurt, thankfully, but the timing was impossible to ignore. 3 months after the creek restoration, and suddenly the neighborhood's manicured core was collapsing. The HOA, now under Luis Delgado's leadership, immediately blamed increased water flow from a disrupted watershed. I bristled at the implication. The creek had existed long before sidewalks and swing sets. If anything, restoring it had prevented worse flooding. But when reporters arrived and cameras rolled, people needed a villain. And I, unfortunately, was still the most visible suspect. The news trucks returned. "Man's personal creek may be linked to neighborhood collapse," one anchor proclaimed. Another segment simply asked, "Did Justice Brooke go too far?" I was furious. The very thing that had saved homes during the storm was now accused of destroying the neighborhood's identity. But the more I looked into the sinkhole, the more I realized something far stranger was going on. It wasn't just about water. The soil analysis came back from the state geologist's office. The ground beneath the park wasn't just unstable, it had been tampered with. Evidence of old piping, possibly abandoned utility lines, and, most perplexing of all, what appeared to be signs of artificial drainage structures, long buried and long forgotten. That meant someone, decades ago, had tried to reroute the spring. Not just cover it up like Margaret had, but trap it, block it, redirect its flow underground through engineered means. And now, all of it was breaking down. Luis visited me in person that week. "I need your help," he said. "I think this goes deeper than HOA records. This whole place, it's built on a lie." And so began the second war for Justice Brooke. Only this time, the enemy wasn't just bureaucracy. It was something buried, leaking from the past, pulling secrets toward the surface like roots splitting concrete. The more we dug, the more we found. Old deeds, forged permits, a dispute from 1954 about eminent domain, records of a settlement sealed by court order, and at the center of it all, a company that no longer existed, tied to a scandal no one wanted to remember. This wasn't just a story about revenge anymore. It was a reckoning. And the creek was just the beginning. We started digging, figuratively at first. Luis had access to a trove of scanned HOA records and legal filings from decades ago, thanks to a community digitalization grant. What we found didn't make much sense at first. There were permits that had been issued and revoked, properties that appeared on maps but no longer existed, and multiple mentions of a construction company called Triway Development Co. A name I'd never heard before, but one that popped up again and again. According to the documents, Triway had been contracted in the early 1950s to develop Maple Hollow into a planned community with modern drainage systems. There were even blueprints. But something about the blueprints didn't sit right with Luis. The original stream, my creek, had been drawn in, but then scratched out, and a curved, angular trench system replaced it, marked only with vague technical jargon and a stamp labeled Proprietary Infrastructure Class C. "I don't like this," Luis muttered, scrolling through the images. That's when we found the lawsuit. Filed in 1954 by a group of local farmers, the suit accused Triway of illegally diverting a natural waterway to build out the subdivision. The spring, it turned out, had originally fed a much larger wetland area, an ecosystem that had sustained livestock and crops for over a century. When Triway dammed and buried the spring, dozens of acres went dry, and a small agricultural economy collapsed. The court ruled in favor of the farmers. But before reparations could be made, Triway dissolved. The case was sealed by court order, the plaintiffs paid off through quiet settlements, and the records buried beneath layers of zoning paperwork. But the damage had already been done. The spring had been forcefully redirected, trapped underground and paved over by roads and sidewalks. No wonder the land was unstable. We took our findings to the city, expecting gratitude. Instead, we got resistance. Bureaucracy doesn't like being embarrassed, and digging up a 70-year-old scandal, literally, was apparently bad for the upcoming mayoral campaign. We were asked, politely at first, to stop. Then came a cease and desist order from the city council, citing unauthorized geological disturbance. Luis was livid. "We're trying to save this community," he snapped during a closed-door HOA meeting, "and they're worried about bad press?" Some members of the board nodded in agreement, but others hesitated. The deeper we went, the more uncomfortable people became. There were whispers that if we kept pushing, property values could collapse. Insurance premiums could rise. Entire blocks might become uninsurable if geological instability was confirmed. They had a point, but we weren't the ones who buried the truth. The truth had buried itself, and now it was trying to claw its way back up. Meanwhile, the sinkhole widened. Within a week, The entire jungle gym had disappeared. A nearby bench sank into the earth overnight. The neighborhood children were frightened, their parents were angry, and once again, suspicion circled back to me and my creek. That's when the anonymous letters started showing up. At first, I thought they were threats. One was scrawled in blocky handwriting on yellowed paper. "Leave it buried. The ground remembers." Another was typed, unsigned, and simply read, "You don't know what you're releasing." We took them to the police, but they shrugged. "Probably just a crank," they said. "Don't feed the paranoia." But I wasn't paranoid, neither was Luis. We knew what we'd found, and we weren't done. So we organized a town meeting, not through the HOA, not through any official channel, but word of mouth. People came, dozens of them. Some were angry, some were scared, but most were just confused. They'd moved here for peace, for quiet, not to be drawn into a decades-old environmental cover-up. Luis stood before them, clear-eyed and firm. "We can't ignore this," he told them. "This isn't just about the creek. This is about whether the ground under your homes is stable, whether the people who built this place told the truth, and whether we're willing to fix what was broken, even if we didn't break it." Some people left, but many stayed. A few even offered to help, including an old man named Henry Vance. Henry was in his late 80s, one of the original residents of Maple Hollow. He shuffled to the front after the meeting, clutching a manila envelope. "They paved over a spring that shouldn't have been touched," he said. I tried to tell them back then. Nobody listened. Inside the envelope were photographs, black and white, slightly faded. Images of the original creek, back when it snaked through untouched fields. One photo showed workers in hard hats building a concrete channel. Another showed a bulldozer burying part of the stream. "I knew it had come back to bite someone," Henry said. "Didn't think I'd live to see it." We scanned the photos, added them to our growing file. This wasn't just history, it was evidence. But the ground wasn't finished with us yet. 3 nights later, a second sinkhole opened, this time beneath a cul-de-sac near the western edge of the neighborhood. A parked SUV slid into it like a toy in a bathtub. No one was hurt, but the damage was worse than before. Cracks spiderwebbed through the street. A utility pole tilted ominously, water gurgled up from somewhere deep beneath. It was clear now. The spring was reclaiming its path. And nothing, no cement, no bureaucracy, no neighborhood fear could stop it. By the second week of November, the water table had risen so dramatically that even Karen's once pristine lawn began to bubble and squish underfoot. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not me. This was the same woman who had poured cement into my creek bed and told me to respect community aesthetics. Now she was hauling wet carpet out of her basement, cursing loudly enough for her voice to echo across the block. Luis and I had tried warning her. Twice. Once after the first sinkhole, and again after Henry shared his photos. But Karen dismissed it all as urban legend paranoia. She told Luis he was drunk on his new authority and accused me of orchestrating hysteria. She even went as far as filing a complaint with the HOA board, demanding we both be sanctioned for inciting eco-terrorism. That was 3 days before her foundation cracked. It happened overnight. A heavy rainfall had saturated the already weakened earth, and sometime around 3 a.m., a muffled rumble shook the neighborhood. Lights flicked on, curtains parted. A few of us ventured outside in bathrobes and flashlights following the sound. Karen's house stood still, except it was no longer standing level. One corner had sunk at least 8 inches. Her front steps now sloped awkwardly, one side of the porch nearly submerged, and from beneath the foundation, a slow but steady stream of water was rising. Not trickling, rising. We watched, dumbfounded, as it pooled, overflowed, and began running across her driveway. Her decorative brick walkway buckled. Her manicured shrubs floated like tiny buoys. And then, impossibly, unbelievably, a fat silver fish flopped out from under her home. A neighbor screamed. The fish writhed for a moment, then disappeared back under the house with a splash. Karen herself burst out the front door in a panic, phone in hand, screaming at someone on the other end. Her feet soaked through instantly. She froze, stared down in horror, and finally understood. Her basement was flooding, not just with water, with my creek. Over the next 12 hours, her home transformed into something between a cautionary tale and a surreal art installation. The water refused to recede. In fact, it kept rising. The sump pump failed. So did the backup generator. One plumber refused to enter the crawl space. Another took one look and said, "Lady, this isn't plumbing, this is geology." By the end of the day, 3 fish had been spotted, 2 frogs, possibly a small turtle, and what looked suspiciously like an eel. A neighbor swore they saw cattails growing through the basement stairs, and somehow, despite all this, Karen refused to leave. "This is my property," she snapped when emergency services tried to evacuate her. "I pay my taxes. I'm not leaving my home because of a stupid spring." The city stepped in 2 days later. Structural engineers declared the house unsafe. They posted red tags on the front door. She tore them off. They posted them again. She called a lawyer. The lawyer took one look at the basement-turned pond and said, "Best you accept the insurance payout, ma'am." Karen was apoplectic, and I felt vindicated. But more than that, I felt sad. Because as much as Karen had tormented me, this wasn't just about her. This was about what we'd done, as a community, as a culture. We buried water and expected it to disappear. We paved over wetlands and called it progress. And now that nature was rising to the surface, everyone acted surprised. The media returned with a vengeance. Shoei nightmare, neighborhood home flooded by underground spring. Basement becomes fish tank after creek reemerges. Revenge of the buried waterway. My name came up again. So did Luis's. Some anchors tried painting us as whistleblowers. Others called us activists, troublemakers, even eco-saboteurs. One fringe network suggested the flooding was the result of deliberate sabotage, an environmental stunt gone wrong. But most people weren't interested in conspiracy. They were interested in the story, and the story had reached a tipping point. After Karen's house was condemned, the city council could no longer ignore us. Luis was granted emergency access to municipal zoning archives. I was invited to speak at a town hall, and more residents came forward, sharing memories, photos, old journals, and even hand-drawn maps showing the original paths of the spring. One elderly woman brought in a jar filled with murky water. "I scooped this from my basement," she said. "Smells just like it used to when I was a girl, like cold stone and moss." We were building a case, not just for accountability, but for restoration. Luis proposed a bold plan: reroute the creek openly through the neighborhood, design a green corridor with controlled overflow zones, restore native wetlands at the park's edge, and convert flood-prone areas into rain gardens and bioswales. It wasn't just eco-friendly, it was preventative. At first, the idea seemed absurd, too expensive, too radical. But then the insurance estimates came in for the sinkholes. The cost of inaction suddenly dwarfed the cost of reinvention. And that's when something remarkable happened. The same people who had once accused me of destroying property values began donating to the restoration fund. Children painted signs that read, "Let the water flow." Teens helped clear debris from the remaining creek bed. And one morning, a familiar figure showed up on my front porch, soaked, muddy, and hollow-eyed. It was Karen. "I'm not apologizing," she said bluntly, "but I want to help." She handed me a check. And just like that, the woman who had once buried my creek in cement had joined the team to help dig it back out. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the rooftops in late November, icing over the sidewalks and sheathing every bare branch in fragile white. But the ground, saturated with water and fractured with stress, didn't freeze the way it used to. Instead, it cracked in eerie patterns, jagged spiderwebs stretching across pavement and lawns alike. The creek didn't stop either. It kept flowing under and through, threading its way into everything. We worked through the cold. Bundled in scarves and gloves, volunteers carried stones, logs, and native plants to the edges of what was now called the Justice Brook Greenway. Luis organized weekly restoration events. Karen, to her credit, showed up each time. She never said much, but her silence was purposeful, like someone who had finally started listening. There were setbacks, of course there were. One morning, we found spray-painted graffiti across the new retaining wall. "Drain the swamp," in thick red letters. Another day, someone poured quickset cement into a culvert inlet, but the tide had turned. Dozens of neighbors helped remove the blockage. Kids repainted the wall with a mural of fish and birds and willow trees. What began as retaliation had grown into resistance and then into rebirth. Karen surprised us again in December. She called a community meeting at the library on neutral ground. She stood at the podium in a charcoal coat, reading from a yellow legal pad. "I was wrong," she began, voice low. "I confused control with care. I thought that to preserve beauty, we had to enforce uniformity. I see now that real beauty flows from resilience and from listening to what the land is trying to tell us." You could have heard a pin drop. When she stepped down, a few people clapped. Hesitantly at first, then stronger. Luis nodded toward me, and for the first time in over a year, I felt the weight of the fight begin to lift from my shoulders. Over the next few weeks, momentum built. The town approved a pilot grant. Environmental engineers arrived with ground-penetrating radar and soil sensors. Local news aired a segment about Maple Hollow's wetland renaissance. Former HOA board members offered apologies, or at the very least, stepped aside. Even Henry, the curmudgeon next door, baked a pie for the next volunteer day. Then came the thaw. March rolled in with heavy rain, and the snowmelt returned the land to mud. But this time, we were ready. The bioswales worked. The creek, no longer hidden, danced through its new channels, free, visible, alive. Wildlife returned, salamanders, dragonflies, a heron. The same creek that had once been buried beneath concrete and lawsuits now sang again through the neighborhood. And Karen? Karen sold her house, what was left of it anyway. The insurance covered most of the demolition. The lot was donated back to the community. We planted trees there, set up a small bench, installed a wooden sign etched with her chosen words. Resilience runs deeper than concrete. The neighborhood changed. Not all at once and not perfectly, but it shifted. People waved more, argued less. The HOA, now a skeleton of its former self, focused on real needs, plumbing, potholes, local noise ordinances, and stopped trying to dictate fence colors or lawn heights. As for me, I still walk the creek every morning. Murphy follows the trail ahead, ears perked, tail high. Sometimes I find new footprints in the silt, raccoon, deer, the occasional child's boot. And every so often I stop at the bend where Karen's house once stood, watching the water wind through cattails and mossy rocks, a mirror of all we nearly lost. Justice Brook wasn't just a stream. It was a warning, a witness, and ultimately a way forward. We didn't just restore it, we let it restore us. Spring turned to summer, and with it came warmth, not just from the sun, but from a changed community. Maple Hollow, once locked in stifling conformity, had begun to breathe again. Trees grew taller, lawns grew wilder. Gardens bloomed not in strict boxes, but in joyful bursts of color and chaos. And through the heart of it all ran Justice Brook, the re-emerged creek, glistening like a vein of life. But while the surface had calmed, something deeper stirred. An old memory, a final reckoning. Restoration, I'd learned, wasn't just about nature. It was about truth. And there was still one thing buried beneath all that concrete we hadn't dared to face. My father. He had built our home with his hands, decades before the HOA existed, long before Karen moved in, and before the creek had been managed into oblivion. As a child, I remembered how he'd sit beside the water, running calloused fingers through the current, saying things like, "This land remembers," and, "If you care for water, water will care for you." After his passing, I tried to hold on. I kept the house, maintained the yard, protected the stream. But the pressure of modernity, of covenants, fines, polite threats, wore me down. I let the battle go quiet for years. I let the cement settle. And a part of me always wondered if I'd betrayed him by giving up. That guilt resurfaced now, not as sadness, but as fuel. Because even though Karen had been the villain in our little story, the real rot had started before her. It was systemic. And it lived in our archives, in our bylaws, in the suburban myth that progress meant perfection, and that perfection was paved. Luis and I began pushing further. With Karen's house gone and the Greenway officially recognized, we had leverage. We requested full access to historical land surveys. We petitioned for environmental impact disclosures from the HOA. What we found floored us. Back in the 1980s, the original developers had knowingly diverted the creek, yes, knowingly, burying parts of it in concrete tubing and cutting corners on drainage to maximize buildable lots. The documents even showed flood warnings that had been suppressed or ignored. Worse, the HOA had inherited that risk and continued to issue permits for patios, retaining walls, and pool foundations directly over the ancient streambed. It hadn't just been Karen. It had been all of them. I felt anger rise again, hot, old, and electric. But this time, it wasn't about revenge. It was about repair. We brought the evidence to the town council. We published it in the local paper. Luis coordinated an independent audit of HOA policies. What followed was a cascade of resignations. A new board was formed, one focused on transparency, safety, and environmental harmony. No more ornamental restrictions, no more cement cover-ups. And one by one, the worst offenders, the concrete footpaths, the sunken fences, the misaligned patios, were torn up or redesigned. The final piece came in July, during the dedication ceremony for Justice Brook. The whole town showed up. Karen, quieter now but present, stood alongside me as I read the dedication aloud from a wooden podium beside the creek. This water was lost but not gone, hidden but not dead. It waited, and when we remembered how to listen, it returned. People clapped, children splashed in the water. The mayor unveiled a sculpture, a twisted pillar of recovered rebar and cracked concrete, entwined with flowering vines and etched with the names of those who helped bring the water home. I stepped back from the crowd and let the noise fall away. I walked down the new path, smooth but natural, lined with stones and wildflowers, and sat beside the bend where the creek once vanished into a culvert. Now it flowed freely, curving past cattails and into the distance. Murphy nudged against my leg, tail wagging. I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt something deeper than victory. I felt peace. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of balance, of flow, of life returned, of a home restored. But peace, as I quickly discovered, isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of stewardship. A month after the dedication, a county official named Dr. Aruna Jain visited Maple Hollow. A soft-spoken hydrologist with a sharp gaze, she walked the creek with Luis and me, her field boots crunching through reeds as she made notes in a waterproof tablet. When we reached the site of the old culvert, she paused, scanned the soil line, then crouched low. "The aquifer's rebalancing," she said, tapping a finger to the earth. "But it's slow, and your water table's still unstable. You've changed the surface, beautifully, but the subsurface? It remembers the damage." I asked what she meant. "Underground cavities," she said. "Saturation pockets. Your neighborhood may still be at risk of sinkholes for years unless we reinforce the land and create intentional overflow basins." Luis swore under his breath. I felt my stomach tighten. After all we'd done, we were still in danger. But we didn't panic, not this time. Within a week, we convened a public forum. The same neighbors who once scoffed at the idea of restoring a ditch now sat on folding chairs with serious faces, ready to hear about sedimentation, porous soil, and water pressure displacement. Dr. Jain showed drone footage of shallow cave-ins forming just outside property lines. It wasn't fear-mongering, it was science. And people listened. We applied for a state environmental resilience grant, then another. Luis and I worked with Dr. Jain and a crew of geologists to draft a proposal for the Maple Hollow Flood Remediation and Habitat Enhancement Project, what we jokingly called Fix the Underground Part 2. It would involve soil aeration, selective excavation, and the installation of engineered wetlands in the community park and 2 donated lots, including the former site of Karen's house. And that's when Karen surprised us one last time. She reappeared at the town council vote, paperwork in hand, her name listed as a co-signer on the land easement form. Not only had she formally gifted the lot to the town, she had waived any payout. "It's my way of letting go," she told me quietly after the meeting. "The house was never mine, not really, but maybe this land can become something better." In the months that followed, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The engineered wetlands filled with rainwater and overflow from Justice Brook, creating lush habitats for frogs, turtles, and songbirds. The underground cavities were grouted with eco-friendly foam that allowed for water movement without collapse. We planted willows and red maples along the newly stabilized slopes, and slowly, the water table balanced. By fall, the creek was no longer a fragile ribbon. We had turned it into a living artery. Children took field trips to the site. A local school began a citizen science program to monitor the ecosystem. Seniors from the retirement community down the road came to birdwatch in the morning. Even Henry installed a rain garden, though he still complained about the mosquitoes. The final surprise came in November, just before the first snow. A fish returned. A real one. A gleaming, silver-sided native brook trout spotted by a biology student at the headwaters near my yard. It was small, barely 4 inches, but unmistakable. A survivor. A scout. I wept when I saw the photo. That night, I stood barefoot at the creek's edge, the cold seeping into my skin, and whispered, "You found your way home." Because in the end, that's what the story was about. Not punishment, not pride, but home. And how sometimes when you fight hard enough, love deep enough, and listen long enough, even what's lost can find its way back. The water had. The fish had. And maybe, just maybe, we all had too. The first snow came gently. Tiny flakes silent as ash fell over the town and dusted the banks of Justice Brook. The water didn't freeze right away. It kept moving, weaving dark and glassy between snow-flecked stones. The old-timers said it was a good sign. "Means the earth's still breathing," one said, sipping from a steaming mug beside the trailhead. I walked the length of the creek nearly every day that December. Not out of worry, out of awe. No matter how many times I traced its path, I found something new. An otter's slick track near the overflow basin, the delicate imprint of deer hooves on the south slope, even a pair of foxes curled together in the hollow of a fallen log. It was like nature had been waiting, poised at the edges of town until we gave it permission to return. Christmas came and went. Then the thaw, then the new year. With 2026 came change, real, official change. The new HOA board passed a sweeping set of reforms. Native plantings were not only allowed, but encouraged. Lawn pesticide use was restricted. Water runoff guidelines were updated to match best practices for watershed health. And a portion of every annual fee now went into a dedicated conservation fund. We even renamed the neighborhood. It was no longer the Groves at Maple Hollow, just Maple Hollow. Simple, honest, grounded. That spring, I found myself helping lead the first community volunteer planting day. We put in milkweed and black-eyed Susans and little bluestem grass along the retention berm. Karen showed up, muddy gloves in hand, chatting with a couple from the far cul-de-sac like they'd been neighbors forever. No one mentioned the past anymore, not to erase it, but because it had been folded into something larger, something forgiving. One morning in May, I found an envelope taped to my door. It was handwritten, addressed to me. Inside was a photo, old, black and white. My father, young and wiry, standing barefoot at the same creek bend where I now often sat. He was holding a coffee can full of fish fry, smiling at the water. On the back, in faded pencil, he'd written, "Day 1, let's see who comes back." Tears welled up in my eyes. There was no name on the envelope. I didn't need one. I framed the photo and hung it above my writing desk. Below it, I added my own note. They came back, and so did we. That summer, the town was officially awarded its Watershed Stewardship certification. We held a festival to celebrate. Food trucks lined the park. Local artists displayed paintings of birds and reeds and rain. A young girl recited a poem about mud and magic. And at the heart of it all, the creek curved like a ribbon, alive with minnows and laughter. As dusk fell, I wandered back toward the quietest part of the greenway. Murphy trotted ahead, his nose twitching at frog song. Fireflies blinked over the water. And there, on the far bank, a great blue heron stood still and proud, as if claiming its rightful place. I didn't move, I didn't speak. Because some moments, like water, are best left flowing, unbroken, unburdened, just present. And in that silence, I knew the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the creek, to the land, to the life we'd helped restore. And it would carry on long after we were gone. As summer ripened into late August, something unexpected happened, quietly, without ceremony, as if nature had planned it all along. A second trout was spotted, larger this time, healthy and iridescent. darting between submerged rocks near the rebuilt footbridge. Luis and I stood on the edge of the trail, watching as it held position against the current. A perfect, living answer to a question we'd once been too tired to ask. Could we really bring it all back? He nudged my shoulder. Guess your dad's coffee can did more than you thought. I laughed through the tears. He always said fish are more patient than people. We said nothing more after that. We didn't need to. As the last light of the day scattered across the creek's surface, I took one final walk along the path, past the places that used to hurt. The cement scars now covered in clover, the echo of shouting HOA meetings replaced by the trill of evening birdsong. In the distance, I heard kids skipping rocks. Somewhere someone was playing a guitar. The smell of honeysuckle carried on the breeze, and Murphy let out a sleepy huff at my feet. I sat down on a flat stone, just like I used to as a child, and reached out to let the cool water pass over my fingers. It was the same creek, and yet it wasn't. It was better. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole. The way it should have been all along.